Hi everyone, I'm Stephen Downs. Welcome back to Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. In this talk, I'm going to talk about the idea that, talk about the question of whether analytics and AI can be ethical or have ethical properties at all, and if so, where they come from. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because I think this will probably cover ground that many people are familiar with, but I do think it needs to be addressed and, if you will, dispensed with. So let's start with what is, I think, a fairly typical assertion of this view. This is Audrey Waters writing a couple of years ago, and she writes, "A pedagogy controlled by algorithms can never be a pedagogy of care, integrity, or trust." And I understand why she would say that. I mean, after all, there are certain limitations to what machines can do, and these limitations are fairly familiar to us, including, they have difficulty driving on highways, they have difficulty interpreting text, as the transcripts from these talks has shown, and they have difficulty demonstrating care, integrity, or trust. But never? How do we know this? What would make this true? What if everything, including even things people do, is an algorithm? Even what do we mean in this context by pedagogy of care, integrity, or trust? Now, we've covered that last question, I think, quite a bit, especially in the previous model. But how do we get to that point from talking about analytics and AI? How do we go from the machine to care, integrity, trust, etc.? Well, and of course, can we? Well, here's my argument. There's a pretty simple argument here. My argument is, if we can have hate, we can have hate speech. And we can have hate, obviously. And we certainly have heard many instances over the years of hate speech. And in my own country, people like Jim Keegstra and others have, felt the force of the law because they did exercise hate speech. And if we have hate speech, we can have hate literature. Again, I think that is pretty obvious. There is hate literature. Hate literature is defined in law. It is identified. There are laws against it, at least in Canada. Probably to some degree, even south of the border. But we certainly know that it exists. And literature is a technology. Now, it's not digital technology, I agree, right? Although a lot of literature is expressed using digital technology, but of course literature existed long before digital technology. But you go back, you have the Gutenberg press, and you have offset print, web offset printing, you have distribution networks, book binding, all of the rest of that. That's technology. It's very simple technology, and nobody pretends that it's intelligent technology, but nonetheless, it can produce hate. And we don't actually say that the technology is at fault here. Generally we think of it as the users or the producers of the hate. Nonetheless, we have technology that is hate. And the question here I would ask is, why wouldn't it be the same with care, integrity, or trust? If you can have hate technology, you can have care technology. And I know it sounds like I'm doing a little bit of a sidestep and a dance around Audrey Waters' point, but I think it's an important sidestep and dance, and I think that the evidence suggests that we need to take it. There is this desire, especially in education, to depict technology as neutral. And Ian McNaught, for example, writes about this widespread desire to depict technology as pedagogically neutral, saying, and you've heard this many times before, it's not about the technology, it's the pedagogy that matters. The technology just enables us. But it's not really clear, to me anyways, that technology is neutral. And in one particularly striking slide presentation a number of years ago, I showed slides of the printing press, the handgun, and nuclear weapons and said, really? Really? Is technology neutral? Really? And I think that is an important point. But even more to the point, technology isn't a simple conduit of intentions. There is what we call opinionated software. I'll give you a good example from our own field, and that's Moodle. Moodle was designed as a learning management system. But Moodle was designed explicitly, and it's in the docs, explicitly to promote a constructivist approach to technology, or to enable a constructivist approach to technology. It's opinionated. And similarly, for any technology, it's not simply taking you from A to B. It defines how you work. It creates opportunities through new affordances, and it imposes limits. All technology is to some degree opinionated. And the opinion of the technology, whatever it is, reflects the intent and the purposes of the authors, designers, and deliverers of that technology. Give you a little example of how this can transpire. Think about the concept of user-hostile technology. This is quoted from a little article called When Technology Hates Us by Paul McFedry, saying, go into any of the little cafes or horlogeries on Paris's left bank, and sooner or later you will hear someone say, les choses sont contre nous. Things are against us. The thing in many cases is the technology. I've often said, my computer hates me. Not about this computer, but about my computer. And it's not literally because my computer has this sentiment that similar to a sentiment that I might feel and actively hates me, but nonetheless it can produce all the behaviors that I would interpret, were I thinking of it as a human, as hate. And at the very least, that's not simply a property of the computer. It is actually a reflection of the properties, the intents, desires, purposes, and feelings of the people who designed it. If I have a computer that hates me, or at the very least is indifferent to me, it's because the designers hated me or were indifferent to me or whatever. And that's how we get user-hostile technology. They haven't done things like user testing. They haven't done things like follow standard design principles, etc. The little article here from, the 1960s talks about this from ost.gov. We see that especially in some of the more recent examples of the failures of AI. Take, for example, Tay, which is the racist AI created accidentally by Microsoft. And what happened is they created this artificial intelligence powered chatbot. They put it out there into the world to be trained by people, and people immediately trained it to be racist. To quote Stephen Baranier, there is a saying in computer science, garbage in, garbage out. When we feed machines data that reflects our prejudices, they mimic them, from anti-Semitic chatbots to racially biased software. It's not just racism. Even benign impulses can be fed into computers. We also have Zoe, the politically correct AI. And here, when a user sends a piece of flagged content at any time sandwiched between any amount of other information, the censorship wins out. Mentioning these triggers forces the user down the exact same thread every time, which dead ends. And there are some examples in the article. For example, a person says, I was bullied today. The computer responds sympathetically and helpfully. The person says, I was bullied because I'm Muslim. The computer says, I have absolutely no interest in chatting about religion. Basically, anytime it spots one of these words that might be contentious, it basically switches off the conversation, shuts it down. We're not interested. That seems to me to be a pretty good example of an indifferent or uncaring computer. You know, we've seen this over the last 2 decades. We've seen the use of big data and the use of algorithms leading to decisions that harm the poor, reinforce racism, and amplify inequality. I covered a whole bunch of that in the module on issues in artificial intelligence. And arguably, and in this Scientific American it is argued, in the Wikipedia article, it is argued. Let's try that one more time. In the book Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill, it is argued these tools share 3 key features. They are opaque, unregulated, and difficult to contest. It is arguable that a tool designed this way, opaque, unregulated, difficult to test, is a tool designed for hate. Right? You've built hate into your software. And nobody would contest, I think, the idea that coming out the other end actually is hate. It's not this thing that could never be hate because a computer can't feel hate. It is hate. And that's why we treat it as such. And it's not just a simple case of bad stuff in, bad stuff out. It's not a non-neutral conduit. The technology actually works with what comes in. Here we have an illustration of a feedback cycle where technology amplifies and sometimes magnifies hate and bias. And again, technology that works that way can be thought of as technology that is hateful, can it not? Because it's actually producing more hate than it has been fed. Now, it depends on being fed hate. It depends on being designed the way it is, with the feedback loop built in, with the algorithm creating an algorithmic bias, etc. But essentially, out the other end is coming hate. It's not just bias. I mean, we talk about bias all the time when we talk about analytics and AI. And Powles and Nissenbaum argue that academia and business have become almost completely focused on the question of bias in AI algorithms and AI data. And the objective here is to simply tweak the data and the algorithms to produce fairness. And they say this discussion of bias in AI has swept across the disciplines. It's not whether simply a few computer engineers think of this as a technical problem to be solved. That same belief also extends to people working in ethics law and media. But that's not the case, obviously. The problem with bias isn't simply a technological problem. It's a social problem. It's not a computational problem. The computational problem can magnify it, but the computational approach could also diminish it. Equalizing, moreover, representation merely co-opts designers into a larger task of perfecting vast instruments of surveillance and classifications. So even the act of treating bias and prejudice in AI might produce other bad effects. And solving for bias, or focusing strictly on solving for bias, detracts us from bigger, more pressing questions. So we've got a number of balls in the air here now, and let's be clear about them. We've got the problem with hate and bias, etc., existing in the population that feeds data in the AI. We have the problem of the people who design and program the AI perhaps not caring, perhaps building in intentionally mechanisms that produce even more magnified outcomes. And we've got the problem of focusing on some specific problems about AI and treating them as technical problems causes us to overlook some of the wider problems with AI. Sacha Baron Cohen talks about the deliberate use, not just of AI, but of technology in general to produce propaganda. And he writes, all this hate and violence is being facilitated by a handful of internet companies that amount to the greatest propaganda machine in history. He says, the algorithms these platforms depend on deliberately amplify the type of content that keeps users engaged, stories that appeal to our baser instincts and that trigger outrage and fear. So, the title of this presentation is The Machine is Us. Think about it. We've got the data coming in, we've got the design of the software, we've got the business models behind the software, all working to produce hate and violence. So yeah, you can have technology that hates, but that technology that hates is in important ways indistinguishable from the people that hate or the society that hates. In other words, us. And I alluded to deeper issues as well, and we touched on some of them a little bit with Sacha Baron Cohen talking about the incentives. And these deeper issues, and these are discussed by Doug Belshaw, include the financial incentives that create these online publishers in the first place, the centralized nature of the web, despite its original design to be decentralized. It was commercialized and brought into basically a central management structure. And then the design of the technologies themselves, especially social network technologies, to lock us in so that even if the technology is harming us in some way, we can't get out of it. We can't get away from it. And, we should be thinking that all of these things that produce bad results and that produce quite literally hate can produce their opposite. Why would we not think so? But it's the way we need to be thinking about it that makes this clear. When we consider the mechanisms of hate, it's not simply that you have this analytics or AI system standing there on its own and somehow it produces hate, right? It doesn't have feelings of hate, and it has no prior disposition to produce hate, and arguably all by itself it might not be able to produce hate. Maybe it could, but it really wouldn't be what we recognize as hate. But when we look at all of this together as a wider system, where we have all the people doing the designing, the providing the data, creating the business models, managing the technologies, all of that together very definitely and demonstrably produces hate. And so when we talk about whether technology can produce the good things, like integrity, care, and trust, we shouldn't be thinking about whether an AI or analytics system all by itself can produce the feelings necessary in order to produce these good kinds of ethical results. No, once again, it is this wider system of data input, designers, business models, and all the rest of it that can produce care. Now, we know we can produce hate. It's not clear that we can't produce care, although arguably we don't know how. But the question here isn't going to be whether we can have algorithms that provide care, integrity, or trust. The simple evidence of algorithms that produce hate, distrust, and more shows that we can produce these kind of results with technology. The question is, what would a technology that produces care, integrity, trust, or whatever it is that we think of as ethical look like? And how would we approach designing one such technology? And that's the motivation for this module, right? It was important to me to pull out all the different processes that go into analytics and AI to examine the sorts of decisions that we make as we design these systems and as we use these systems, to see where the care, the trust, whatever goes into it, and even to see what we would think counts as an ethical approach to these design and delivery decisions. We know pretty much how to use these to produce hate, whether through an absence of care, whether through a deliberate manipulation of the technology. But we haven't spent nearly as much time on all of the mechanisms that produce ethical machines. So the purpose of this module as a whole is to be clear that, by an analysis of the actual mechanisms of producing analytics and AI, the actual workflows, the actual decisions that we take, we can see what the ethical import of our contribution to that is, and how that can produce the result that presumably we would like to see. So that's the beginning of this module, and now that we've done the preliminaries, we'll go into actually looking now at the different stages of the AI and analytics workflow. So that's it for now. That's it for this short video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot. I'm Stephen Downs.